Chapter 1: The Boy from Omaha. It is the winter of 1924 in Omaha, Nebraska. A baby boy named Charles Thomas Munger is born on the first day of January into a country that has no idea what it is about to face. In 5 short years, the Great Depression will sweep across America, wiping out fortunes, closing banks, and breaking families. Charlie grows up in the middle of it. Money is tight. Hard work is the only currency that never loses value. As a teenager, Charlie takes a job at a small grocery store in Omaha, a store owned by a stern, demanding man named Ernest Buffett. The hours are long, the pay is low, and the lessons are brutal. Decades later, Charlie would joke that the work was so grinding it taught him exactly what he never wanted to do for a living. But it also taught him something deeper, that discipline, patience, and showing up every single day were the foundations of everything. What few people noticed about young Charlie was the engine running behind his eyes. He read constantly. He devoured books on every subject imaginable: science, history, biography, biology. He would later call great thinkers his friends, men he met only on the page. He was sharp, opinionated, and almost impossibly stubborn. When World War II erupted, Charlie left college without finishing his degree and enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Corps. The military, recognizing his raw intelligence, trained him as a meteorologist and sent him to study at Caltech in California, a state that would one day make him rich beyond measure. Then came the boldest move of his young life. With no completed undergraduate degree, Charlie applied to Harvard Law School. He was initially rejected, but a family connection intervened, a phone call was made, and the door cracked open. Charlie walked through it and never looked back. At Harvard, surrounded by some of the brightest legal minds in the nation, he didn't just keep up, he dominated. In 1948, he graduated magna cum laude, one of the very top students in his entire class. He was 24 years old, brilliant, married, and standing at the doorway of a promising legal career in sunny Southern California. From the outside, it looked like a flawless rise, a poor depression kid who clawed his way to the top through sheer intelligence and grit. But fate was not finished with Charlie Munger. The next decade would test him in ways no law school could ever prepare him for. The young man who had everything in front of him was about to lose almost all of it: his marriage, his money, and something far more precious than either. Before Charlie Munger would ever become a billionaire, before the world ever knew his name, he would first be broken. And how he chose to respond to that breaking would define the rest of his extraordinary life. Chapter 2: Everything Falls Apart. By the early 1950s, Charlie Munger looked like a man on his way up. He had moved to California, joined a respected law firm, and started a family. He and his first wife, Nancy, had 3 children. He was building a career, paying his dues, working the long hours of a young attorney trying to make partner. And then, quietly at first, the cracks began to spread. In 1953, Charlie's marriage collapsed. The divorce was painful and, by the standards of the time, financially devastating. Charlie walked away with very little. He moved into a dingy apartment, drove a beat-up car so awful he was almost embarrassed to be seen in it, and worried constantly about money. He was a Harvard-educated lawyer, and yet he felt close to broke. But the worst was still to come. Around this time, Charlie's young son, Teddy, was diagnosed with leukemia. In the 1950s, a leukemia diagnosis in a child was almost always a death sentence. There were no cures. There was no hope to cling to, only the slow, agonizing certainty of loss. Charlie did what any father would do. He visited his son in the hospital, holding the boy, watching him fade a little more each day. And then, according to those who knew him, he would leave the hospital and walk the streets of Pasadena, weeping, a divorced man nearly broke, watching his 9-year-old child die and utterly powerless to stop it. In 1955, Teddy died. Charlie was just 31 years old. Imagine the weight of that moment: a failed marriage, a drained bank account, a dead son. Most people would have been shattered beyond repair. The grief alone could have ended his ambition forever. But Charlie Munger possessed a quality that would become legendary: an almost ruthless ability to accept reality exactly as it was, no matter how cruel, and to keep moving forward. He did not drown in self-pity. He did not surrender. He later expressed a philosophy that captured this iron mindset perfectly: Assume life will be hard, and then ask whether you can still handle it. If the answer is yes, in a sense, you've already won. Charlie chose to handle it. He threw himself into his work. He rebuilt his life piece by painful piece. In 1956, he remarried to a woman also named Nancy, and together they would eventually raise a large, blended family. He kept practicing law, but in the back of his mind, a different idea was taking shape. The law paid the bills, but it would never make him truly free. And freedom, independence, was the one thing Charlie wanted above all else. He would later say plainly that he never set out to be rich. He just wanted to be independent. What Charlie didn't yet know was that a single dinner in his hometown of Omaha was about to change the entire trajectory of his life and create one of the greatest partnerships in financial history. Chapter 3: The Partnership That Changed Everything. The year is 1959. Charlie Munger returns to Omaha to settle the affairs of his late father. Mutual friends arrange a dinner and introduce him to a young, intense investor who is already making waves running money for local families. His name is Warren Buffett. He is 28. Charlie is 35. The chemistry is instant and almost electric. The two men talk for hours, finishing each other's sentences, laughing at the same jokes, attacking the same ideas from a dozen angles. Buffett would later say that meeting Charlie was one of the great strokes of luck in his life. Here were two Omaha minds, both obsessed with rationality, both allergic to stupidity, both convinced that the conventional wisdom of Wall Street was largely nonsense. Buffett began urging Charlie to give up law and devote himself to investing full-time. The logic was simple, and it was the same logic Buffett applied to everything. The law was fine, but it would never compound the way capital could. Charlie listened. In 1962, he took the leap. While still involved in law, he co-founded an investment partnership, Wheeler, Munger and Company, operating out of California. For the first time, Charlie Munger was no longer betting on billable hours. He was betting on himself, on his judgment, on his ability to find great businesses and hold them with iron patience. And the results were staggering. From 1962 to 1975, Munger's partnership delivered an average annual return of roughly 20%, crushing the Dow Jones, which limped along at around 5% over the same stretch. Charlie wasn't diversifying into hundreds of safe little positions. He was doing the opposite. He concentrated his bets, pouring enormous sums into a handful of companies he understood deeply and believed in completely. It was high conviction, high risk investing, the kind that can make a fortune or destroy one. Charlie had the stomach for it. He famously understood a truth most investors never learn, that the big money is not made in the buying or the selling, but in the waiting. While others panicked and traded frantically, Charlie sat still, letting his best ideas compound year after year. During these same years, he also pursued real estate development projects in California, building condominium complexes and reinvesting the profits. It was one of these ventures that helped him earn his first serious money. The first few $100,000 that he later described in his blunt, unforgettable way as the hardest to accumulate. Get past that first hurdle, he insisted, and everything afterward gets easier. By the early 1970s, Charlie Munger had clawed his way from a broke, grieving divorcee to a wealthy, respected investor with a brilliant track record and a partnership in Warren Buffett's inner circle. He had taken enormous risks and been richly rewarded. But the market has a way of humbling even the smartest men in the room, and a financial storm was gathering, one that would push Charlie's concentrated, high-conviction strategy to the absolute breaking point. Chapter 4: The Crash That Nearly Broke Him. In the early 1970s, the American stock market was riding high on a wave of optimism. Then, in 1973, the bubble burst. An oil crisis erupted as Middle Eastern producers slashed supply. Inflation surged, the economy stalled, and the stock market entered one of the most brutal bear markets since the Great Depression. The S&P 500 would lose nearly half its value. For most investors, it was painful. For Charlie Munger, with his concentrated all-in style, it was catastrophic. Remember, Charlie didn't spread his money thinly across dozens of safe positions. He made big, bold bets on a small number of companies. When markets soar, that approach makes you spectacularly rich. When markets collapse, it can wipe you out. And in 1973 and 1974, the losses came like body blows. In 1973, Munger's partnership fell by roughly 32%. The next year, 1974, it fell again, by nearly the same amount. In just 2 years, a huge portion of the wealth Charlie had so carefully built was simply gone, evaporating in a relentless slide that seemed like it would never end. Picture the psychological torture of it. Charlie had clients, investors who had trusted him with their money, their savings, their faith. Every day the market opened, the value of their holdings shrank further. Charlie knew, intellectually, that the businesses he owned were still good businesses. He knew their underlying value hadn't truly collapsed. Only their stock prices had. But knowing that doesn't silence the fear. It doesn't stop the phone calls. It doesn't erase the gnawing dread of wondering whether you've been wrong all along. This was the ultimate test of everything Charlie believed about investing and about himself. The temptation in such moments is overwhelming, to sell, to cut your losses, to flee to safety and stop the bleeding. Most investors did exactly that, locking in their losses at the worst possible time. Charlie did not flinch. He held on. He had built his entire philosophy on the idea of buying wonderful businesses and waiting. And now, in the darkest hour, he forced himself to live by it. He understood something most people never grasp under pressure, that the market's price and a business's value are two very different things, and that panic is the enemy of wealth. And then the storm broke. In 1975, the market roared back to life, and Munger's partnership came roaring back with it, surging by an astonishing 73% in a single year. The investors who had held on were made whole and then some. The discipline had paid off, but the experience left a deep mark on Charlie. The wild swings, the stress of managing other people's money through a near disaster, it convinced him that he wanted a different structure entirely. In 1976, he wound down the partnership. Charlie Munger was about to consolidate everything into one extraordinary vehicle and step into the role that would make him a legend. Chapter 5: The Sweetest Deal in History. To understand the turning point of Charlie Munger's life, you have to understand a single box of candy. By the early 1970s, Charlie and Warren Buffett controlled a company called Blue Chip Stamps. In 1972, an opportunity landed on their desk. A beloved California chocolate maker called See's Candies was for sale. The asking price was around $30 million. The business had hard assets worth only a fraction of that. By the cold, traditional logic of value investing, the bargain-hunting style Buffett had learned from his mentor Benjamin Graham, paying such a premium was almost heresy. But Charlie saw something Graham's old formulas couldn't measure. He saw a brand customers loved. He saw a company that could raise its prices year after year without losing a single loyal buyer. He pushed Buffett to pay up for quality. They negotiated and bought See's Candies for $25 million. It would become one of the most important purchases either man ever made. See's went on to generate well over $1 billion in profits for Berkshire over the following decades, all from that initial $25 million investment. More importantly, it transformed Warren Buffett's entire philosophy. Charlie had taught him a lesson worth billions. It is far better to buy a wonderful company at a fair price than a fair company at a wonderful price. This was Charlie Munger's true genius, not just picking stocks, but reshaping how the greatest investor of all time thought about value itself. In 1978, Charlie officially became vice chairman of Berkshire Hathaway, cementing the partnership that would dominate the financial world for the next half-century. He became Buffett's intellectual sparring partner, the man whose job, as Buffett himself joked, was often simply to say no, to kill bad ideas before they could cost a fortune. But even at the height of his rise, tragedy was never far away. In 1980, Charlie underwent surgery on his eye. Complications set in, leaving him in excruciating pain. Doctors ultimately had to remove the eye entirely. For a man whose entire life was built on reading, who consumed books the way others breathe air, the prospect of losing his sight was terrifying. He even began studying how to read Braille, preparing himself, as always, for the worst-case scenario. Most men would have raged at the unfairness of it. Charlie simply adapted. He accepted the loss with the same stoic resolve that had carried him through his son's death and the market crash. He kept reading, he kept investing, he kept thinking. Under his and Buffett's guidance, Berkshire Hathaway grew from a struggling textile mill into one of the most valuable companies on the planet, worth hundreds of billions of dollars. The broke, grieving lawyer from Pasadena had become a billionaire, and one of the most respected minds in the history of business. But Charlie's greatest legacy wasn't his money, it was the wisdom he left behind. Chapter 6: The Wisdom That Outlived the Money. Charlie Munger lived to the age of 99. He died on November 28, 2023, just 34 days short of his 100th birthday, leaving behind a fortune estimated at more than $2.5 billion. But ask anyone who studied him, and they will tell you the same thing. The money was never the point. Charlie's true wealth was the way he thought, and the ruthless honesty with which he faced a life full of loss. Step back and look at the full arc of his story. A child of the Great Depression, a young father who buried his 9-year-old son, a divorced man who once feared he was broke, an investor who watched a third of his wealth vanish in a market crash, a reader who lost an eye. By every measure, Charlie Munger was handed more than his share of suffering, and yet he refused to let any of it make him bitter. Instead, he turned each catastrophe into a kind of education. He believed, like the ancient Stoics he admired, that every misfortune was an opportunity to behave well, to learn something, to grow stronger, to become wiser. His secret was almost embarrassingly simple. He didn't try to be a genius. He tried, in his own words, to be consistently not stupid, to avoid the catastrophic mistakes that destroy most people, rather than chasing brilliant moves that might impress them. He read voraciously, built mental models from dozens of disciplines, and judged ideas not by who said them, but by whether they were true. And above all, he committed to a lifelong habit he described with crystal clarity: to wake up each morning and try to be just a little wiser than he was the day before. Do that long enough, he promised, and the compounding effect on your life would be extraordinary. He never set out to be rich, he insisted. He only wanted to be independent. Free to think his own thoughts, free to live on his own terms. The billions were simply the byproduct of patience, rationality, and an almost superhuman refusal to panic. He understood that the biggest money is made not in frantic buying and selling, but in the quiet discipline of waiting. So what is the real lesson of Charlie Munger's life? It is not a stock tip. It is not a formula. It is something far more powerful and far more useful to anyone listening right now. Life will deal you tragedy. It will deal you loss and failure and moments that bring you to your knees. You cannot control that, but you can control how you respond. You can choose to keep learning. You can choose to stay rational when everyone else is losing their head. And you can choose, as Charlie Munger did, to turn your darkest moments not into excuses, but into the very foundation of an extraordinary life.